Thank you, Marissa, and good morning. And thanks, first of all, to AKEI for inviting me to be a part of your forum here today. It's a great honor. It's been a good trip so far, and I hope to learn as much today as everybody else is, because I think you've got a good lineup of speakers here today. So I'm here to speak about measurement, and I was asked to give a presentation on event or exhibition measurement, and I said, well, that's kind of a broad topic. It can cover a lot of different aspects of measurement, and I looked at the time. I said we have about 45 minutes, so I said, well, we better narrow it down some. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit different perspective, perhaps. And first, let me tell you a little bit about exhibit surveys, just so you understand what I'm going to be talking about here today. So roughly half of our business comes from organizers of exhibitions that want to do research on their shows, whether it's simple research to evaluate their satisfaction or measure ways to improve performance, or whether it's covering very specific aspects of a show, like how do we track more attendees. That's the kind of research that we do for the organizer side. We also work for exhibitors, mostly large companies who, what we will refer to, and I'll probably catch myself saying this, but we call them anchor exhibitors. But they're typically the bigger companies that participate in shows, many of which, by the way, are participating internationally. So our U.S. clients in these big companies have taken us internationally because they've required us to have a consistent measurement program in place for them. So I thought about what I was going to speak about here today, since I had some latitude with the whole subject of measurement, and decided that I'd focus on a very narrow area, which is how organizers can actually work with individual exhibitors or assist individual exhibitors in improving their performance. The motivation behind that was some information that we just collected not too long ago. We were doing some surveys of organizers in the United States, and what we found is that the attrition rate, what we call the attrition rate, or the number of exhibitors that they lose each year, averages about 20%, okay? So if you're losing 20% of your exhibitors from each show, think about what that does to your costs, all right? There's obviously a direct cost, a sales cost, of having to do a better job of replacing those 20% exhibitors that you've lost from the year before. So that's something to be concerned about. But you're also losing growth because of it. So if you're a show that grows, let's just take, say, 5% a year, and if you only improved your attrition rate by 5%, maybe that growth could be 10% instead of 5%. So I think there's real value in organizers taking a look at how they might be able to help their exhibitors in improving performance. So I'm really going to focus on about 7 different ways that organizers can work with exhibitors in improving their performance. Some of them are very basic, some of them are going to be very obvious and very simple. Some of them are more advanced. Some of it's just work that we've been doing just the last year or so for a number of organizers. But I think it'll give you a sense of the role that you can play in helping exhibitors improve their return on investment. And if you're helping them improve their return on investment, then you're more likely to have happier exhibitors, keep them longer, and have better growth. And that's kind of the concept behind what I want to be presenting here today. So what I'd like to do is first start out and just give you some slides that talk a little bit about the concept before we get into those 7 ways of working with exhibitors. And by the way, I should have mentioned that this is going to be very data-driven. Thus the title. You see the tagline on the title. We're a measurement company, a research company, so we should be data-driven. But in today's world, one of the things that we're finding, again, particularly for the large exhibitors, is that all of their decisions are starting to become very data-driven. There's no more what we call seat-of-the-pants decisions that are being made. A lot more is being made on sound decisions. So we hear so much about big data today. We hear about data analytics and so forth. It's coming to the trade show world. And those kinds of decisions that we're going to be talking about here today that exhibitors need to be making, if they can make them on good sound data, as opposed to just, as I said, seat of the pants, or just what we call gut feelings about what they should be doing, I think they're going to make better decisions. I think they're going to be doing better in your shows, and I think therefore you'll have exhibitors that are getting more satisfaction and more value out of participating in your shows, which will translate into return on investment. So let me just kind of set the tone here in a couple of slides here just to kind of set where I want to go with this. So all of the research that we do from an organizer's perspective, we stay focused on what we call the event ecosystem. So ecosystems, there's environments have ecosystems, businesses have ecosystems, markets have ecosystems. An event's no different. An event has an ecosystem, and every ecosystem has various constituents or members that are part of that ecosystem. And for any ecosystem to be strong and healthy and growing, they all have to receive good value, right? So if you look at this diagram here and think of your trade show or your event as an ecosystem, basically what we have here is we've got various constituents. Many of you out there are organizers, so you have the organizers, we have the exhibitors, and we have the attendees. And I'm not mentioning the suppliers, but of course the suppliers are an important part of that. But if you think of each of those constituents, they all have something they're looking to accomplish at the show. So an organizer, those of you that are organizers, obviously you have a return on investment you're looking for. You're looking to generate revenue from that particular event. In the United States, where we've got probably about 2/3 of the trade shows that are actually owned by associations, what we find is that they may also have organizational goals. They have missions for their events that may be focused on education, it may be focused on certification, whatever. They have to accomplish that as well. Revenue is still a big part of it, but they have other reasons for going to the show. Right? You look at the exhibitors. Exhibitors, obviously they're looking for a return on their investment. Some of them may be looking at it purely from a sales perspective, identifying the next lead that's going to turn into the next sale. And some of them may be looking at it from the perspective of what we call return on objectives, which are sort of softer metrics of trying to build awareness, enhance the brand, et cetera. All right? And then, of course, we have the attendees, a very important component. A group that oftentimes doesn't have as much voice in things as some of the other constituents. But the attendees are looking for something very simple. Not very simple, but they're looking for highly valued information, whether that information is coming from their exhibitor base, or whether that information is coming from the education that's provided, or whether that education is coming from the peers that they meet and talk to as part of their networking at that show. All right? They're also looking for that on a face-to-face basis. And they want that personal interaction. That is why they're there. So what we're going to be focusing on here today is the exhibitor portion. How do we enhance or help that exhibitor improve the value that they get from participating in these shows? As you can see, if you look at the arrows in these diagrams here, from an exhibitor's perspective, and every constituent, by the way, has something to give as far as value, and they also receive value from the other constituents. So in the case of the exhibitors, they're obviously the main source of revenue for the show, but they're also of value in helping to draw attendance to that show. That's why it's important to have the big names in your shows, because they do help to draw attendance if you can promote the fact that they're there. All right? From the organizer's perspective, obviously they've got to deliver a qualified audience, and they've got to deliver a good experience. And I think we sometimes lose sight of that the experience that an exhibitor has, even though it has nothing to do with whether they do well from a return on investment point of view or not, they have to have a good experience, otherwise it taints or it affects the perception that they have of that particular show. And looking at going from exhibitors to attendees, obviously the exhibitors are a big source of highly valued information, and doing that on a one-on-one basis, and what they expect in return from the attendees is that engagement that takes place on the floor so that they can achieve their return on investment. So we're going to stay focused on that exhibitor side. Just real quick, in terms of value, one of the key barometers that we look at for any show is what we call overall value, simple 5-point scale from excellent to poor. On a 5-point scale, attendees are getting an average of about 4.0, not too bad. Exhibitors, though, are a little bit lower. A lot of reasons for it. The exhibitor has more at stake. They're investing more than an attendee does. So they're a little bit more critical in terms of what they expect as a return on their investment. All right? But there's also the problem that we have in many shows that we see, and that is that many exhibitors come unprepared. You can deliver the audience, but if they're not prepared to take advantage of that audience, they're not going to do well. But it's the gap that we're looking at here, and you'll never see that gap close completely. Again, I think because there's too much, it's a difference at stake for each of them, but the goal should be to try to close that gap. Similarly, we measure something called Net Promoter Score, something that's starting to become universally accepted in major corporations. We're now seeing it introduced into the trade show industry. But the Net Promoter Score is simply, it's a measure of customer loyalty and customer satisfaction, or brand loyalty, I should say. And what the research that's been done on it shows that there's a high correlation between good or high Net Promoter Scores and the ability of an organization to grow, and in this case, trade shows. Again, and I'm not sure why we have the value score there. Something wrong with my slide there, but that should be, I think it's 40, 42, and I think it went up to 44% this year or something like that. But there's been a slight increase from the attendee and from the exhibitor point of view, and as you can see, though, there's still that gap. So these are just two metrics that we use to test the value of the show, and really just to illustrate here for this presentation purpose, that there is a need for exhibitors to do a better job if we want to lower the attrition rate in shows. I also want to introduce a little bit of the perspective of the exhibitor. If you're going to talk about helping an exhibitor improve the return on investment, then I think it's important to have a good sense of how they think. What kind of decisions do they have to make about participating in your show? Right? As you can see from this wheel, this is work that these are the kinds of things we do with the exhibitor community when we're working for companies. We're working with them in each of these areas, but what each of these areas, on these 5 areas that you see on this wheel here, represent the kinds of decisions that they're making all the time about their exhibit programs. And we'll talk about each of these. It starts with the alignment of the developing exhibiting objectives that are in alignment with their business objectives, pretty obvious. Show selection and investment decisions, probably one of the toughest things they go through, and simply because there's not a lot of good information in our industry about the shows that are out there. The next is optimizing the tactical drivers of the return on investment. So these are what do they decide to do in order to reach or achieve their strategy for a particular show. Lead generation and follow-up is extremely important, simply because it's the primary metric that they use to measure their success for most companies. Most companies are going to have some sort of a lead objective in play, particularly the small and medium-sized companies. And then, of course, measurement comes into play. How successful were we? More importantly, how can we improve? So they're constantly looking for information and data that's going to help them make the decisions in each of these areas. And I could spend a whole presentation alone just on talking about this one slide. But I think the purpose for putting this up here as part of this presentation is for you to at least have a sense of how those exhibitors are thinking. And as you'll see when I talk about the different types of data that they might need to make these kinds of decisions, you as organizers can play a role in that regard. And just one last slide here in terms of the exhibitor and how they think, and that is, what is their success criteria? What we call the 10 and 20 footers in the US, which are the 10-foot booths or the 20-foot booths, and we're talking feet, not meters, of course, but they're the smaller exhibitors in the show. Typically, most of them are there for lead generation purposes. But as you're talking to those larger exhibitors, their success criteria is much more complex. They've got many, many more reasons for coming to the shows. And as they do come to those shows, they're trying to accomplish some of the things that you see here, whether it's in the marketing area, the sales area, and the research area, or the partnering area. Many more reasons for coming to a show. The only reason I mention this and give you this as a basis for what we're talking about here is that these are the kinds of things that they're going to need help with. And if there's anything that you can do to provide assistance in helping them achieve some of these kinds of objectives, you're going a long way to helping them stay in the show and get more value from the show. So it's a long way of going and getting into the prep of talking about the 7 ways that organizers can improve exhibitor ROI. And this is the practical part of the presentation. Some of this, as I said, is very basic. You're going to see it. Some of it is maybe less basic, all right? Some of it may not apply to you, depending upon your type of show. But if you can walk away, I think, with one or two practical ways of providing exhibitors with the kind of information that's going to help them do a better job in your show, you're going to do a lot to improve your own business growth. So I'm going to start with what we call fit analysis. That's just a term we use internally, and this is really research that we do from the organizer's perspective, but it's just a quick example of the kind of information that really looks at it from the exhibitor perspective. So when we do surveys on shows, we're doing surveys of exhibitors and we're doing surveys of attendees. We may also do non-attendee surveys and non-exhibitors, but let's just keep it simple, attendees and exhibitors. We don't just do separate surveys to see what each thinks of the show. What we try to do is to see what is the alignment between the way that the expectations, the interests are of the exhibitors versus that of the attendees, and vice versa. Shows that have good alignment between interests and needs, and they don't have to be the exact interest and needs, but they need to be compatible. Shows that have good alignment are generally shows that are growing and growing faster. So this is a fairly simple way of identifying where there are possible opportunities for improving value from either an attendee or an exhibitor's perspective, or in just identifying what the issues are. So I've kept this very simple. We look at a lot of different criteria, but I just wanted to take one example here and talk about it from the exhibitor's perspective, because that's what we're here. One of the questions that I feel that you really need to ask in every survey that you do of your exhibitors is, what are the types of attendees that they're most interested in reaching? And I've kept this very basic in terms of just looking at the job titles and functions or the types of businesses. If you're a medical event, it's going to be different criteria. But you just want to basically find out, what are your exhibitors who are they most interested in reaching? You then match that up against the profile of who's coming to your show, and you start to see the gaps that may exist. And if there are gaps, as I said, it's going to create value issues, bad value issues from the standpoint of your exhibitors, but it's also an opportunity to improve that value and to bring attendees to the show that those exhibitors are most interested in reaching. Probably the best way to illustrate, okay, here we go. Here's a quick example, and this is just, I dummied up some of the titles and so forth, not to reveal who it is, but again, pretty simple. You're looking at, here are 4 job titles and functions. I just made them up or copied or used different ones for purposes of masking the identity here, but I think we measured 15 or 16 in this particular show. These were the top 4, all right? So 81% of exhibitors were interested in reaching, in this case, directors, all right? If you go over and move over to the third column over there, only about 6% of the audience fit that category. So the most important category to the exhibitors had fairly low representation. But we took that one step further, and we looked at, in the potential column, we looked at their attendee promotional database. In other words, these are people that they promoted to come to the show, but did not come. Now, in this particular case, it was an association. These were primarily members of that association, so it was pretty much of a closed community that they had a tight understanding of. But as you can see, 20% of their membership were directors, but they're only getting 6% to the show. So that has a value issue for the exhibitor. Just by increasing that 6% and focusing on increasing that 6% should help to improve the return on investment from the exhibitors, because that's the most important category that they're interested in reaching. So this is just an example from a strategic point of view, how you can look at your shows and try to identify the markets that are most important to your exhibitors and who you need to focus on reaching in the future. All right, switch gears and talk about some of the ways that you can help in terms of actually driving performance for an individual exhibitor. We talked about it strategically in the first way. This is a model that we've created. When we got started back in 1963, we actually started working for individual exhibitors before we worked for organizers, measuring their performance. And this basic concept has evolved over the years. We've actually done a lot of work with universities to actually do some multivariate analysis to test this model, and we use it quite frequently in the performance of individual exhibitors. The only reason I'm showing you this is to give you a sense of what is driving the performance for your exhibitors. What do they need to do in order to do a better job? And more importantly, what can you do to assist them in doing a better job? So it starts with the potential audience. And this is the one concept I think it's very important to get across to everyone, to attendees. Rarely do we find a company, even if it's a very large company in a very vertical show, but rarely do we find everybody in the show that's interested in their products or that is a potential prospect for their products. So step one is to really define that target audience. And there's a lot of reason for doing that. One is, for purposes of performance, is that's what should be your basis of performance, right? Not how many of the total attendees you reach, but how many of your prospects did you reach. So the size and the value of your target audience does that. As you'll see a bit later, it also should become the basis for investment. Do you have a large or a small target audience? Obviously, the larger that target audience is, the more you're justified, or that exhibitor is justified in spending. Right? But I think what this does is it puts some reality into the show and sets expectations of your exhibitors, which I think brings them down to reality in some cases. But when we talk about actual performance, it first begins, how well do you attract those people? All right? Well, on average, the average major company today, at least in the US, and some of this has some Asian shows reflected in it as well, and European shows, but on average are attracting about 81% of that target audience that we're talking about there. All right? If we go up to the next step, staff engagement, that's the face-to-face, the interaction I was talking about before that takes place. As we say, that's where the rubber hits the road. If you don't have the engagement, you rarely achieve results. It seems like whenever we measure the performance of an individual exhibit, whether their results are to build awareness, to enhance their brand, to generate leads, unless that face-to-face engagement takes place, rarely do they achieve good results. Attracting your potential audience is not enough. And as you can see, there's quite a gap there. Now, this is the responsibility of the exhibitor. It's not your responsibility as an organizer to try to do something about that, though some have, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But this is the model. Probably what's more important, though, from your perspective is what can you do? What role can you play as a result, or as it relates to this particular model? The first thing, obviously, is providing them data to define that size of that target audience, making this a realistic investment for them. What can they realistically achieve? Don't sell on the basis, hey, I draw 25,000 attendees to the show, but how many of those 25,000 of those attendees are really their target? Right? We've seen companies in the US that have audited their shows for one simple reason, and that was to bring their exhibitors, bring them into focus as to what's realistic. So if you have 20,000, 25,000 people that come to that show, and only 5,000 of those people are part of their target audience, and that company is only generating, let's say, 200 leads out of that 5,000 target audience, the real discussion should be, how do I get you from, 200 leads? From 200 leads to 300 leads, or from 300 leads to 400 leads. It shouldn't be about reaching the 25,000, and it even shouldn't be necessarily, for most companies, reaching all of the 5,000. It's about improving performance. So by providing that kind of data, simple data, I'll give you some examples in a minute, that will help you to bring some realism to the individual exhibitor and set their expectations. Now, the other area that you can get involved with is attraction. All right? So what we have found, again, from our measurement research, is that the three most important factors that you see listed there, the variables that you see listed under attraction here, in terms of what drives the ability of an exhibitor to successfully attract their potential audience, it's number one, size of exhibit, and it doesn't necessarily mean bigger is better. It simply means that they should have an exhibit sized relative to the size of their potential audience, right? And the second thing is promotion, attendance promotion. You provide a lot of that promotion information to them, or opportunities, I should say, directory advertising, on-site or online advertising on their website, and so forth. So these are the kinds of things that you can help with by understanding this. You can play a role, particularly for those exhibitors that aren't necessarily that well educated about how to achieve success in a trade show. So some of these things I've already talked about, but just real quickly, documenting the need for the size of the potential audience, setting those expectations. In the US, we've got some companies, or organizers, I should say, that like to take it to the next step of actually documenting the buying power of an audience. What does that audience represent? How much do they buy? They don't make all their decisions, or they don't buy at the show all the time, but how much are they purchasing as a result of participating in that show? That can go a long way to substantiating the value of the show. Attracting the potential audience, I talked about it. I'm going to show you a tool in just a second that's available that allows you to estimate, based on the size of the target audience, what level of investment you are justified in making, or an exhibitor is. I mentioned promotions. We call them MPOs, or marketing promotion opportunities. That's nothing more than advertising in the directories. It's the online advertising, sponsorships, and so forth. And the thing on the bottom here is, again, it's not something you have much control over as an organizer, but it's very important to an individual exhibitor, and that is the use of attention-getting techniques in an exhibit. That's kind of a broad term, attention-getting techniques. But generally speaking, if you look at what companies use, it will dictate whether they're doing a good job of selectively attracting or not. If they're doing a lot of things with contests and things that draw a wide group of the audience that's just interested in participating, whatever that game or that contest is, you're going to over-attract, and that can impact negatively on performance. If they're using focused types of techniques, let's say product demonstrations, that type of thing, even theater presentations that focus on a product that's on their product, generally speaking, they'll do a better job of selectively attracting. So I mentioned tools. Now, this is a tool that was developed a number of years ago for our industry in the United States. I think, quite frankly, it could be easily applied here in other countries. The big difference is that we deal in square feet and you deal in square meters, so there'd have to be some adjustments made. But this is a tool that can be used to work with individual exhibitors to show them how much exhibit space do they really need. First of all, what's the size of their target audience? Based on that target, what is a justifiable amount to be spending on space? And also, how many staff do they need on duty to attract those people? It's a simple calculator. Basically, the information comes from you in terms of defining the potential audience, the size of your attendance. They would make the determination as what portion of that audience fits their target, all right? And the outcome of that are what you see on the right. Again, size of potential audience. So in this particular case, here's a show, 23,000. Their potential audience is actually about 8,600 of that 23,000. And based on that 8,600, here's how much space they need, how much staff they need to achieve their results. Simple tool, it's not all the answers, doesn't get to everything that they need to do to perform successfully, but at least it gets them thinking realistically about your show and what opportunities for ROI they have. Staff engagement, as I said, not a whole lot you can do there. We've seen a lot of organizers in the United States understand the value of staff engagement and try to provide that training. And as we like to say, it's like bringing a horse to the water. You can bring them to water, but you can't make them drink. We don't find that there's a high level of participation in that kind of staff training. However, when we're working with individual companies and we see them doing training specifically for their staff, training that relates to how to work an exhibit, and not just being a good salesperson, but how you work an exhibit, we've seen tremendous increases in results. And so companies in the States, I know, a lot of them are willing to invest in that kind of training because it pays off. As an organizer, I think it's pretty tough for you to be in a position to try to do that. But nonetheless, I think it's important to understand. What you can control, though, all right, is the experience that the exhibitors are looking for. Now, here I'm usually talking about larger exhibitors. But what we're finding, at least in the United States, is that the larger exhibitors, they want options. It's not all about having a big exhibit on the trade show floor. Yes, that's the space that you're selling as an organizer, but they're looking for different options. They want sponsorship opportunities. We all know about that. But many of them are also looking for alternative ways to interact with the types of attendees that you attract to the show. They want to be off the floor. So let's give you an example. National Plastics Exposition. It's our largest plastic show, probably not as big as the K show, but it's in Germany, but it's about 100,000 square feet of space, or I'm sorry, 1 million square feet of space, 100,000 meters, I think that is, right? But what they did is they were having a very difficult time attracting the materials people, the plastics resins people, the people that make the plastics that go into the machines and that are ultimately how the products are made. They were, for years, trying to get them to buy space, and what was happening is they'd be in the show for a while, they'd drop out of the show. So what they did is they came up with a concept called customer centers. And customer centers is nothing more than each of these material people buying about 1,600 square feet of space, but off the show floor, a whole different environment. So the environment that these people wanted was one that was more of a one-on-one interaction that they could have, where they could entertain, much more controlled environment, and an environment where they could take their customers on tours of specific exhibits on the show floor. They wanted to be able to go to the plastics machinery companies that were using their plastic materials and show them. They were more than willing to spend the money that required. So many of them were making the same investment. It's just that what they were doing is interacting with their audience in a much different way. So that's an example of what I mean by customizing the engagement experience. And quite frankly, in the US, there's a lot of resistance to that. And the resistance is, hey, it's easier to sell concrete. It's easier to sell that space on the show floor than it is to make the kinds of accommodations that requires. The other thing that you have some, as an organizer, have some control over is what we call traffic density. So a traffic density, it's just a metric that we use and that we've been using for many years to evaluate the level of activity that takes place on the show floor. Again, we're talking square feet, not square meters here. But all this really says is that on average in 2014, the average density was 2.2 people per 100 square feet of space throughout the period the show was open. It's nothing more than an algorithm that we use to say, is the density high or is it low? All right? The problem with lower densities is that the small and the medium-sized exhibitors particularly have a tough time competing for the time and the attention of the visitor. All right? So we've actually seen some organizers, believe it or not, control their space sales to match their growth in attendance. And that's tough to do because obviously that's the revenue source. But they realize that long term they're better off having a denser show floor of people on that show floor than they are in just selling as much space as they can and lowering that density. Because generally speaking, the lower that density gets, the higher the correlation with lower values on the part of exhibitors. So there's a practical side to having a good density level, which is the ability for the smaller and medium-sized companies to compete. But there's also a perception problem, or perception issue, I should say, about the performance of individual exhibitors in terms of how they perceive, I should say, their return on investment just because of the density on the floor. So it's one of those things where you're looking for the balance in your growth. And you can't get away without bringing the attendance to match the growth that you have in the square footage. I started at 10:15, right? So I have a few minutes. Okay. I didn't see my signs up there, so. All right, this is an area where something relatively new. We've only had 2 shows do this, and we've just had it done in the last couple of years. But what we're finding is that we've got a couple of show organizers, 2 of the more progressive show organizers that we work with, that have actually taken it upon themselves to measure, at least on a high level, to measure their top 20 or 25 exhibitors in the show, right? You might think of this, hey, this is a nice service and a nice added value that they provide to the exhibitor, and it is. It really is. And that exhibitor gets a lot out of it, and I'll show you a quick example of one of these things in just a minute. But the more important value is that they create a strategic relationship with that individual exhibitor. Because generally what happens when they do this is, yes, there's a discussion about the performance of the exhibit, and they appreciate that information. but almost always it leads into the next level of conversation, which is how can we improve the show for you? And the exhibitors, particularly your major exhibitors, can be the best source of what's going on in the industry and the direction that the show needs to take. So there's a show we have called the National Association of Broadcasters show, the NAB show, in Vegas, another very large show. And they've been doing this for about 3 years now. And they're actually getting more feedback from their exhibitors about where the market's going than they know what to do with in some cases. That's helping them determine where that show should go. And that's an interesting industry that's had to evolve. It's not just about broadcasting anymore. We all know that content can be delivered through any channel and on any type of device. So they have some challenges ahead for them. But the whole idea of measuring that performance has opened up some strategic relationships that I don't think they would have had otherwise. If nothing else, you should be making it easy for the exhibitors to measure performance. That may be as simple as providing them with the lead acquisition equipment that is going to give them good information about who their leads are, the quality of the leads, how many they got, and so forth. But performance measurement is a part of this, maybe not a huge part of it at this point, but I think down the road, as companies, as individual exhibitors, and as organizers become more partners, I think you'll be seeing more of this. This is just a sample of that. I know you can't read it. It's in there. And by the way, anybody's welcome to this. If it's not going to be on AKEI's website, I'm more than welcome to give it to anybody if they want the presentation, and you can read this data at your leisure. But all this really is if you recall what I showed you before in the exhibit performance model, this has some of the key metrics in it that were in that model, all right? So it opens up that conversation. We compare it to other exhibitors in the show. We compare it to some of the norms that we have from all of the shows that we measure. So it gives them some context and some perspective of how they're doing. The scores that you see, the colored dots, just nothing more than a quick way of saying, hey, they're doing well or they're not doing well in a particular area. And we also look at it from a results point of view. What impact did they have on consideration to purchase and influencing purchase consideration, the net promoter score, et cetera. The metrics aren't important, right? I mean, they are important in working with an individual exhibitor, but for this presentation, the metrics aren't key. It's the fact that there's something being done to generate information that allows that conversation to take place with the exhibitors. I talked a little bit about the exhibitor experience, and I think sometimes we lose sight of how important the tactical elements of participating in a show are to exhibitors, because it generally has an influence on how they perceive the value of the show. Technically speaking, if they had a bad experience with setting up their exhibit, or if they had a bad experience getting their hotel rooms or registering to get into the show, it shouldn't have an impact on their return on investment. But from a perception point of view, it often does. So I think it's important to keep in mind these tactical elements that are important to the exhibitors, because it does affect them. It does affect their perception of the show and those overall value ratings that I gave you before. This is nothing more than some of the averages that we keep for some of the tactical elements of a show. May or may not apply here in the US. The only reason I'm showing them is because if you see the fair and the poor scores, pretty high in some cases, all right? So there are issues that they're facing. These are the kinds of things with the very high ratings in for your particular show would obviously be the things that you'd want to correct, because you want to avoid those pain points as much as you can. And the last way to help control the I is the I in ROI, meaning the cost. We're hearing more and more in the States. As I said, I just got off the board from IAEE, and in that position, we've had a lot of different conversations with some of the exhibitor organizations and even some of the contractors out there. And this whole issue of the cost of exhibiting is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Personally, I think we need to focus on not how much it costs to exhibit, but what value we're getting out of it. But realistically, there are some cost concerns out there. And I think that we can't lose sight of the fact that it is an expensive medium. And so that is something that I think as an industry, probably here as well as in the States, that we need to be facing. And that's why this whole issue of value is why documenting the potential for the ROI is so important. because it starts to change that conversation. It's not so much about how much does it cost, but how valuable is this show. And that's only going to come by documenting it with good information. And by the way, when I'm talking about good information, it's relatively simple to collect. The better job you do on your registration information and getting the demographics and getting the buying power of that audience, the better job you're going to do of being able to help exhibitors define how important your show is to them. So it's not something that's hard to do or even expensive to do. In the US, the cost of square footage represents about 40%, 39% to be exact on average. This just came out from the Center for Exhibition Research. I don't know what that figure would be here, but you can look at that two ways. The cost that you as an organizer charge is 40% or a big part of it, or there are a lot of other costs out there, 61% of the costs, that you have less control over, all right? At least in the US, I know that's the case. So again, it goes back to that cost issue. And it becomes an issue. But it's not all about exhibit space. It's about all of the expenses that go into it. And by the way, these are only direct costs. This percentage here does not take into consideration travel, entertainment, or any kind of expenses along those lines. So let me close and summarize here and give us a few minutes for questions if you'd like. To me, as an industry, if we're going to be advancing and growing, and when I say as an industry, meaning the whole exhibition and trade show industry, I go back to that ecosystem slide. To me, that's the foundation. That's what we need to be living by. We need to provide equal value. Everyone has to be obtaining good value if shows are going to grow. It may sound like an oversimplification, but as soon as a show gets out of balance, and that's why it's important to measure it, because you want to know if it's out of balance and why it's out of balance, then you need to be doing something about it, or it's going to affect your growth overall. I think the industry, again, when I speak of the industry, the trade show, the exhibition industry, needs to evolve in how we sell space. I know in the United States it's a challenge. We have a challenge, we call it a transactional sale, meaning, hey, I've got a piece of concrete to sell you, a piece of space to sell you, here's what it costs, all right? But that sale has to become more strategic. It has to be more consultative in nature so that the exhibitor knows what they're getting out of the show. And a lot of the things that I've talked about, you know, the information, the data-driven approach in here can help in that strategic conversation and help put you more as a partner to that exhibitor as opposed to a supplier of exhibit space. And I think that's a fundamental shift that the industry has to make overall. And I, again, not as familiar with what happens here in Asia, but my guess is that it's similar. So that one-to-one consultative sales strategy, you know, is important. And as I said, I think data is a big part of that. So I hope this has given you some insight. If you walk away with one or two of those ways that might be applicable to you, please use them. Anybody that has any interest in knowing more depth about these, not just here today, but I'm open to having you call me, send me an email. I'll be glad to address any of your questions. But I think we have a few minutes for questions now, right?